Joe. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for that warm welcome. As Joe was saying, at heart, I'm an entrepreneur, and I became an entrepreneur because with my friends, we thought it'd be great to start a business. This was more than 20 years ago, so these are my pals who I started Shazam with. So there's Chris, there's Avery, and there's Philippe. Now, you might be thinking, how do you come up with an idea like Shazam? And it was really simple. So my friend Chris, he would hear music and he'd have no idea what it was. And he'd ask me, do you know what that song is? And I didn't know either. And he thought, you know what would be great? What if you could just use your mobile to identify any song in a cafe or on TV or, if you're listening to the radio? And that's how he came up with the idea for Shazam. Now, it might sound simple, but Chris didn't know anything about technology. So I asked him, so how are you going to make this technology? He said, we'll just have to invent it. Now, Chris was studying business. He didn't know anything about technology at all. And actually, his friend Philippe, I think, did most of the work for him. That's how they became friends. But Philippe doesn't know much about technology either. So we had to find a partner who could invent this algorithm which powers Shazam. And that's Dr. Avery Wang, who's a super, super smart guy. He's an engineer. He's a scientist by background in digital signal processing. And we hunted him down and said, hey, would you like to be our partner and help us to invent this technology? And the poor fellow, he didn't know how to say no. So he said, okay, I'll join the team. And before he knew what was happening, we became partners in this new venture. Now, the technology behind Shazam is incredibly complicated. So even though it's a very simple idea, it required, months and months of hard work before Avery kind of cracked the code and came up with a technology which could identify music. And what's crazy is that although that technology has evolved over time, it pretty much still is what he invented 20 years ago. So we just became entrepreneurs because it seemed like a fun thing to do to solve, a problem which we faced. And we had this technology and we went out to investors and we said, would you like to put some money into the business? And they said, well, how do we know if it's going to be a good business? How are you going to make money? And we said, we'll sell CDs when people use Shazam. And then what happened was that, people stopped buying CDs. Do you guys buy CDs? Do you buy CDs? No? Do you listen to? You do? Some people do. It's great. And then then some of the investors said, but you want to identify any song? Where are you going to find all the music? And it turns out when we started the company 20 years ago, you couldn't get music in digital format. It just didn't exist. So what we had to do was we had a partnership with a company which sold CDs, and we created a digital copy of every single CD which was sold in the UK and typed in the name of the artist and the album and the song so that every time someone used Shazam, they would get this information. So it was crazy because back then it was different. Anyone here have a smartphone? Who has a smartphone here? Okay, back in the day when we started Shazam, there were no smartphones. Anyone use Google? Google? Anyone? Google barely existed. I mean, it was ridiculous. So we found ourselves in a situation where we had a service, trying to get people to use it, get the word out, make some money, and then what happened was, boom, the internet bubble burst. It was really difficult for us to spend anything on marketing. It was really difficult to earn anything because people were not buying CDs anymore, and music was becoming much more like iTunes, for instance. And then something changed in 2008 when the iPhone launched and the App Store launched. Then Shazam became an app. And that's how most people know it today. It became much easier rather than dialing a number and holding the phone up and you'd get a text message with the name of the song and the artist. When it became an app, it was much easier to use. And then finally things changed. So last year, we had an offer from Apple to buy Shazam because they wanted to have a more elegant experience for users to be able to connect with music. So we said, fantastic, it sounds like a great fit. And we sold the business to Apple late last year. Now, this morning, when Sir Anthony was speaking at breakfast, he said, overnight success can take 20 years. And unfortunately, that was the situation for us. When we started out, we thought, this is going to be great. We're going to build a great business. We're going to have, be successful by next year, and then we're done. And it took us almost 18 years from end to end. And that is life as an entrepreneur. You have ups and downs, you have challenges. It takes longer than you imagine, but you have to push through it. And that's what we learn from our long journey and all this gray hair that I have to prove it. But what happened after that was, when I left Shazam, we had hired a management team. I wanted to do something which gave back. So I joined Save the Children. And I had the privilege to spend some time in Cambodia working with young people. And I came away with a real belief in the power of young people to change the world. And that's something which is much more my passion rather than trying to work out, what is that song? I don't know, you tell me. But, and this is something which I spend more of my time and energy on nowadays. So I went from being an entrepreneur to being a charity worker. But I found actually you can mix the two. So in my last role, I was head of innovation at Virgin Money, which is part of the Virgin Group. And their mission is about changing business for good. So the power of business to be able to actually make a positive difference. And now as an ex-entrepreneur, although I'm not sure there's such a thing, I try to invest in tech for good companies. So startups which are trying to have a positive impact on society. Do something which does some good. And I've had the good fortune to have some amazing inspiration. So I met Paul Polman, who was the CEO of Unilever. And he has been working for 10 years on having an impact through how Unilever does business, the suppliers they work with, the partners that they work with. And trying to use business to change the world, change the planet. And I think this is where we're going, actually, because, business is great. For those of you who are entrepreneurs or who want to be entrepreneurs, the excitement, the energy which comes from doing your own venture is something quite special. But it's only business, It's not friends, it's not family, it's not passions, it's not about, changing the world. And I think as we look forward, you will be making the future. And the question to ask yourself is, when you look back, what stories will you tell? What things which you share about your passions? And what I've learned recently is about the Sustainable Development Goals. Anyone aware or familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals? Anyone come across them? Anyone? Okay. If you haven't come across them, it was a set of goals which has been agreed by 193 countries around the world. Things like ending hunger, ending poverty, having an impact on climate change, more equality. And these are big objectives that is not about a small group of people or one country. It's about, the planet as a whole. So if there is something which you're passionate about, my advice would be follow that passion. If there's something which you feel strongly about, make it part of, your journey. And my takeaway was, this is with my pals. This was taken really early on in the business, and this was taken last year when we finally sold it. We just had a really, really good time together. If you're enjoying what you do and you can bring your energy to your venture, then I think that comes through, and hopefully you can create your own stories and feel the satisfaction which comes from making your own future. I'm not sure I'm doing on time, but thank you very much. And if you have any questions, very happy to take any questions.
Excellent. Let's give him a round of applause. A bigger round of applause than that. Thank you. Thank you. So does anybody have any questions for Dhiraj? Surely someone wants to know how they're going to create their own Shazam. Any questions, anybody?
Yes, there's a question there, yeah.
What would you suggest, I'm trying to speak up.
Yeah.
What would you suggest as a good starting point if you've got a business plan and an idea for your, as a potential entrepreneur to start a business?
Yeah, so a good starting point is as an entrepreneur, if you have an idea and a business plan, I think the first thing is to find out, does anyone want it? Because as entrepreneurs, just as we were, you're liable to think, oh, I've got a problem, this is how I would solve it. But it's your customers who will tell you whether it's a problem which they want solved or not. So have a conversation, build a prototype, create a dummy and see if anyone signs up to buy it. And I think that's the first step. I think the second step is to change and evolve the product or the service as you go, because almost nothing is perfect the first time around. So being able to have a vision and an idea, but to be able to change as one goes along as well, that's part of the mind of an entrepreneur. Any other questions? Yes, there's a question about.
How much did you invest in your business when you started?
We invested nothing at all. It's called sweat equity. So we worked really hard from morning to evening and on weekends as well. But we had the good fortune of having outside investors who put some investment in. So when we did our first fundraising was $1 million, and then our second fundraising was about $8.5 million. So it was a huge amount of money back in the day. The good news is nowadays you can start a business with much less money. Yes, any other questions?
I'll ask a question on
Yes.
behalf. I'll ask a
Yeah.
question on behalf of everybody. So
Yeah.
to that last question,
Yeah.
how long was that sweat equity before you got to £1 million? Because £1 million, even today, is a lot of money, isn't it?
Yeah, so we started the business in the month of March, and we raised our initial funding in the summer, so it was August, September. So it was about 3 or 4 months between the time we started the company and the time we raised the money. And in that time, we wrote the business plan, we did some research, we created a demo of how the technology would work. And then we went out and spoke to people who had a track record in music, who understood like mobile phones, who had a technology background, who were willing to back a team of first-time entrepreneurs. And we did it. And we didn't know anything about music and even less about technology. So that's just the way of the entrepreneur, is you have to keep knocking on doors, keep telling a story, keep trying to make the case, paint a picture of the future. And you do that at each step of the way. Fantastic. Okay, great. Thank you so much. Really appreciate this opportunity to tell this story. And and enjoy the rest of the day as well, and hope you come away inspired. Thank you.